Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and this is episode 288 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Today I'm going to share the story of a rifle cartridge that could very well be described as quote-unquote world-changing. As much as I like the cartridge, I'm not talking about the 6.5 Creedmoor today, though. No, this particular cartridge we're going to discuss in detail in this podcast episode came on the scene well over 100 years ago and made a very profound effect on the hunting and shooting worlds. And to top it all off, that cartridge is still around and remains in somewhat common use to this day. So what rifle cartridge am I teasing? It's the 7mm Mauser. Also known as the 7x57 or the 275 Rigby, the 7mm Mauser is a remarkable cartridge that has a legacy few other rifle cartridges can compare to. So in this episode, I discuss the history, legacy, and strengths and weaknesses of the legendary 7mm Mauser cartridge in detail. I also provide some information on how the 7mm Mauser compares to the more modern 7mm 08 and 7mm Remington Magnum cartridges to give you an idea of what sort of performance you can expect from it, and so you can decide if it fits your needs as a hunter. Before we get started, please make sure you are on my email list. To do that, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up there for my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. Not only will you get that ebook, you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. If you like the Big Game Hunting Podcast, you will love those emails. Those are entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they enjoy receiving those emails and how much they look forward to hearing from me every weekday. So make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com or by clicking the link in the show notes and signing up there. Now, as usual, we'll start with the history of the 7mm Mauser. Also known as the 7x57mm Mauser, the 7mm Spanish Mauser, and the 275 Rigby, the 7mm Mauser was one of the first cartridges designed from the outset to use smokeless powder. This gave it impressive ballistics compared to other cartridges in common use at the time. Now, designed for the Spanish Army in the 1890s, which is why it is sometimes referred to as the 7mm Spanish Mauser, the original 7mm Mauser military ammunition fired a 173 grain bullet, or 172.8 grain bullet to be precise, at 2,300 feet per second, which gives you about 2,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Now, that load was very accurate, had a relatively flat trajectory. Remember, compared to many other cartridges that were popular at the time in the 1890s, and it did all of that with a modest amount of recoil. The 173 grain and 175 grain bullets that have also become popular for the cartridge over the years are also quite long and have a high sectional density of .306 and .310 respectively. For that reason, they tend to penetrate surprisingly well. Now, along with those attributes, the 7mm Mauser was first mass-produced in the Model 1892 and 1893 Mauser bolt-action rifles, which were themselves far more advanced than comparable rifles of that time period. Featuring the revolutionary non-rotating Mauser extractor and designed to accept 5-round stripper clips to facilitate fast reloading, the Mauser 1892 and 1893 were accurate, reliable, easy to maintain, had a large magazine capacity, and could be rapidly reloaded. Those are all ideal attributes for a military rifle, and soldiers equipped with those rifles could accurately engage targets at greater ranges and maintain a higher rate of fire for longer periods of time than other military rifles in the late 1800s. Mauser-equipped Boers taught the British Army a hard-earned lesson on the effectiveness of the 7mm Mauser cartridge and the Mauser rifle during the Boer War. Likewise, the American Army had a similar experience when a small number of Spanish soldiers using Mauser rifles inflicted severe casualties on a much larger American force equipped with inferior Krag-Jorgensen and Trapdoor Springfield rifles at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Indeed, the American Army was so impressed with the performance of the Mauser rifle and cartridge that they developed the 1903 Springfield rifle and the 30-03 Springfield, which later evolved into the 30-06 a few years later. Lieutenant Colonel and later President Theodore Roosevelt was famously right in the thick of it in that battle. Heck, he even posthumously got the Medal of Honor many years later for his actions at the Battle of San Juan Hill. But that whole experience of fighting those Spanish soldiers with those rifles and that cartridge made such an impression on him that in the subsequent years, during and even after his presidency, he was a staunch booster of, one, getting a new rifle for the American Army and ensuring that it was in a good cartridge that was on comparable footing with the 7mm Mauser so that there wouldn't be such a lopsided difference between the arms American soldiers were using in a future conflict like he experienced firsthand in Cuba. In the end, the 1903 Springfield rifle was modeled heavily on, some might even say copied, the 1893 Spanish Mauser rifle. The same was also true with the 30-06 cartridge itself, which bears a strong physical resemblance to the 7mm Mauser cartridge and even shares the same rimless case design and .473-inch base diameter. Going back to the 7mm Mauser, it should come as no surprise that that cartridge developed a reputation as an outstanding military cartridge. Additionally, the same attributes that made the cartridge and the rifle so popular with the military also made it appealing as a sporting cartridge, and it soon became a favorite of hunters all over the world. Now, as a quick aside, and I've mentioned this before in other episodes, but it's really interesting how often a revolutionary new cartridge comes along and really catches fire, so to speak, when it is introduced in conjunction with a fantastic new rifle. The 7mm Mauser and the Spanish Mauser is one example. The 30-06 and the 1903 Springfield is another. Same with the .270 Winchester and the Winchester Model 54. And the same is also true with the 7mm Remington Magnum and the Remington Model 700 many years later. Now, not only was the 7mm Mauser introduced in conjunction with a great new rifle in that Mauser 1892 and 93, really, you could make a pretty strong argument that the development of the Mauser cartridge and the Mauser rifle both helped start the trend away from lower pressure black powder cartridges designed for use in single shot and or lever action rifles towards more modern high powered cartridges designed for use in bolt action rifles. And even if it didn't literally start that trend, the 7mm Mauser was certainly at the leading edge of that trend, with cartridges like the 6.5 Swede, the 30-40 Krag, and the 30-06, all coming around in that same general time frame, or at least shortly after the 7 Mauser did, like in the case of the 30-06. Now, on the sporting side of things, hunters especially appreciated the effectiveness of the 7mm Mauser cartridge on medium-sized animals, though the cartridge has also developed something of a quote-unquote mystical reputation on really big, dangerous game as well. All things considered, in my way of looking at things, I think the 7 Mauser is just about perfect for medium-sized game. Whitetail deer, black bear, roe deer, fallow deer, impala, blesbok, etc. It can also be darn effective on bigger species of deer and antelope like red stag, elk, moose, zebra, wildebeest, waterbuck, kudu, eland. Though I would say it's a little on the light side for extremely large animals like American bison and brown and grizzly bear. The cartridge is certainly capable of ethically taking these animals under the right conditions. In that same vein, Jim Corbett detailed multiple accounts of using his .275 Rigby, which, remember, that's the same cartridge as the 7mm Mauser, just with a different name and head stamp. He used that cartridge to take man-eating tigers and leopards in India on multiple occasions in his book, The Man-Eaters of Kuman. That's an outstanding book. You should definitely take a look at it if you haven't already done so. Settlers in Africa during the late 1800s and early 1900s also killed untold numbers of thick-skinned dangerous game like buffalo and hippo with the cartridge as well. Right? Those same Boer settlers who eventually used the 7 Mauser on the British during the Boer War also used that cartridge on all manner of African game in the years before and after that conflict. And finally, no discussion of hunting with the 7mm Mauser is complete without mentioning the fact that Karamojo Bell famously killed hundreds of elephants with his .275 Rigby. No, he didn't kill 1,000 elephants with the 7mm Mauser, regardless of what folks on the internet would have you believe. Let's be specific here. According to Bell, and there are multiple excellent books detailing his exploits in Africa, Bell of Africa is one, Wanderings of an Ivory Hunter is another. According to him, he killed a total of 1,011 elephants in total during his entire career. Now, the meat of his ivory hunting career took place between the end of the Boer War in 1902 and the start of World War I. Now, it goes without saying that things were a lot different back then in many ways. Now, regardless of what folks today might think of the ethics and or the conservation aspects of killing that many elephants like that, specifically for their ivory like he did, the fact remains that he did it, and that his exploits in Africa with a number of cartridges, but especially the 7mm Mauser, do provide some interesting stories to read and to listen to, and also display some interesting trends and strengths of the 7mm Mauser that can be applied to more modern hunting situations with that cartridge and with others. Now, Bell used a number of different rifles and cartridges to kill those elephants, and according to him, he killed more elephant with the 275 Rigby / 7mm Mauser than any other single cartridge. All told, he says he killed about 800 elephants with that particular cartridge, most of which were with a Mauser rifle using the standard military load with a 172.8 grain or 173 grain if you want to round up, round nose, full metal jacket bullet. Rifles chambered in 6.5x54, 303 British, 318 Wesley Richards, 350 Rigby, 416 Rigby, and 450-400 accounted for the bulk of the rest of the elephant he took over the course of his career. While I absolutely do not recommend using the 7mm Mauser for hunting any species of dangerous game, especially thick-skinned dangerous game like buffalo and elephant today, the examples of those early European settlers in Africa and of Karamojo Bell are good examples of how the 7mm Mauser is one of those cartridges that just really quote-unquote punches above its weight and performs so much better on game than one might think initially. Why is this the case? First, many 7x57 loads, especially that 173 grain FMJ bullet we keep talking about, use long bullets that have high sectional density and penetrate very well. Second, the 7mm Mauser is also easy for most people to shoot accurately, and this facilitates placing their shots on an animal precisely where they need to go. For those reasons, a cool-headed marksman that knew exactly where to shoot an animal could use the 7mm Mauser to take game far larger and tougher than you would expect if you just looked at the ballistics of the cartridge on paper. 7mm bullets, especially the non-expanding ones, don't make nearly as wide of a wound channel as .375, .416, or .458 caliber bullets, but if they're placed appropriately, those heavy 7mm bullets have pretty good odds of penetrating through even the thickest muscle and bones to hit the vitals of an animal. This obviously leaves very little room for error. And it's also true that very few hunters have the knowledge of animal anatomy or marksmanship skills necessary to consistently hit exactly the right spot on an animal to quickly, safely, and ethically take dangerous game when using an undersized cartridge for the job like the 7mm Mauser. Now remember, I'm talking specifically right now about hunting dangerous game with the 7mm Mauser. We'll talk more about using the cartridge on other game here in a second. So for those reasons, using the cartridge on dangerous game is illegal in most African countries, and I would say it is ill-advised no matter where you're hunting. Don't let that diminish the capabilities of the 7mm Mauser for hunting, though. It has a very well-deserved reputation for being a wonderful choice for hunting a wide variety of big game because it just works so darn well. Going back to Bell, there are several important reasons why he liked that cartridge so much and used it on so many elephant. For one thing, guys like him used the equipment that they did because it just worked and because their lives depended on it. Right? I mean, you shoot an elephant or a buffalo or whatever and wound it and it kills you, well, that leads to a very short professional hunting career. So if a guy like him is using it for years and years on many different animals like he did with so much success, he's not doing it as a stunt. This isn't like the people that accuse gun writers today of getting paid by Hornady to promote the 6.5 Creedmoor or anything like that. No amount of money is going to convince someone to use something that is inferior for the task. So if a guy like Bell is using it to kill hundreds of elephant, it clearly works, and he's clearly on to something here. Additionally, there were some pretty significant logistical issues with getting rifles and ammo at the time, especially for hunters in Africa like Karamojo Bell. Indeed, he talks in his book that he had a really nice Mannlicher Schoneyer rifle in 6.5 by 54 that he really liked and also had a lot of success on elephant with, but he had to stop using that rifle because he couldn't get ammo for it. Along those lines, military ammo was not only easier to get than a lot of other stuff, but it was also had a reputation for being more reliable than commercial ammo at the time. Remember, we're talking about the early 1900s, and the production of ammunition using metallic cartridges and smokeless powder was still in its infancy. Powder, primers, and manufacturing techniques in general have come a long way since then. Having a cartridge fail to fire could literally mean the difference between life and death, so it was a big benefit to use more reliable military ammunition in chamberings like 7x57 Mauser and 303 British. And though he didn't use the 303 British as much as the 7mm Mauser, Caramojo Bell also used that cartridge pretty extensively as well. Next, there were also benefits to the rifle itself when it was chambered in 7mm Mauser. For one thing, those rifles tended to be lighter and easier to carry than sporting rifles chambered in bigger cartridges. An 1893 Mauser weighed about 8.5 to 9 pounds. That's on the heavy side compared to a lot of the stuff we use today, but that's still a darn sight lighter and easier to carry than a big double rifle that may weigh 12, 13, 14 pounds or more. To put that into perspective, Bell said in one of his books that he walked an average of something like 50, 60, 70 miles for every single elephant he took. So having a rifle that's 20 to 40% lighter is a big deal for a guy like him. That's also an extreme example, but it's still a significant benefit to other hunters. And that also sort of explains the trend that we have seen over the years towards smaller caliber and lighter rifles. In that same vein, the 7mm Mauser has surprisingly mild recoil, even in a rifle that doesn't weigh that much. If I recall correctly, I think it was Frederick Courtney Selous carried a 4-bore rifle for a portion of his hunting career, early in his hunting career, and that weighed something like 12 to 14 pounds, like I was talking about. Now, a 4-bore muzzle-loading rifle like that is a gigantic rifle. Black powder fired a gigantic bullet with a tremendous charge of black powder. Even though it was so darn heavy, recoil was absolutely ferocious when he would shoot that rifle. And like I said, if I recall correctly, he suffered permanent nerve damage to his shoulder from multiple years of hunting with that punishing recoiling rifle. Right, I know this is the internet. Everybody always talks about how tough they are. Recoil doesn't bother them. Okay, fine, right? It's one thing to shoot it at the range every now and then, but if you're going to be carrying and hunting with this rifle for years and your life and your livelihood depend upon your shot placement, having a heavy recoiling rifle will wear on you mentally, and it becomes hard to place your shots properly. So I can understand why a guy would jump at the opportunity to carry a lighter recoiling rifle that was also just a whole lot lighter and easier to carry, especially if it seemed to work as well as it did on elephant or whatever game he was hunting. In that vein, Bell was a big fan of brain shots on elephant. Like we have discussed before, a properly executed brain shot on an elephant will drop the creature immediately. This is in stark contrast to a heart and lung shot, which can be very effective, but in that case, if you shoot the elephant, it's likely going to run 50 or 100 yards or so before falling over. That is an important advantage when trying to shoot multiple elephants out of a herd like he was. Plus, it's also just a whole lot safer. And just by the very nature of how the elephant reacts when you shoot it in the brain, it is immediately obvious if you placed your shot properly. If you do it right, the animal's going to fall over and that'll be the end of it. And if it's not, then it's very simple. You keep shooting until you put that elephant down. Whereas that's not the case with a heart shot on an elephant. Now, I keep talking about what hunters were using back then and why that contrast between the old stuff and the 7mm Mauser was so important. Like I've talked about in previous podcasts, before the advent of smokeless powder, hunters tended to use larger bore black powder cartridges. Put simply, black powder has a relatively low maximum velocity that you can push a bullet at. No matter how much black powder that you put behind a projectile of a given size, it's never going to be able to get nearly as fast as is the case with smokeless powder. So hunters at the time instead switched over to a larger bore projectiles, which is why Frederick Courtney Selous was using that 4-bore projectile. Because what you could do is put a really big charge of black powder behind a really heavy projectile and get it going just about as fast as you could a lighter projectile with a smaller charge of powder. You couldn't really break through that upper limit of the ceiling regardless of how heavy the projectile was. So, okay, let's just use a really big charge with a really big bullet, and that'll put that animal down. Now, it wasn't ideal, but it was the best that they had at the time, and that was just the way that people did it, using really large caliber projectiles that weren't going that fast on big game like that. But it had, just like I said, ferocious recoil. But when you have this much smaller caliber, much faster bullet that penetrates as good or better than those really large caliber lead projectiles propelled by black powder, that's just a sea change. That 7mm bullet straight through the brain of an elephant kills it just as dead as the much bigger and harder hitting stuff. And so you get just that great performance plus all those added benefits of the lighter recoil, the lighter rifle, etc. It's a no-brainer why a guy would make that choice. So as you can see, the 7mm Mauser fit in almost perfectly with the sort of hunting Caramojo Bell was doing. It was available in a light, easy-to-carry rifle, minimal recoil. The bullets penetrated really well to reach the brain of the largest land mammal in the world. Lots of easy-to-find ammo. Rifles and ammo were reliable and dependable, etc. There was lots to like there. Now, while Caramojo Bell is one of the most famous users of the 7mm Mauser, that's not the primary best use case of the cartridge. Like I said earlier, this cartridge, I think, excels on medium game for a lot of these same reasons that he was able to put it to such good use on elephant. So, for instance, Jack O'Connor was famously a big fan of the 270 Winchester, but he was also a big proponent of the 7mm Mauser. He did a fair bit of hunting with the cartridge over the course of his life, to include using one to take his first bighorn sheep. That was a desert bighorn in Sonora in the 1930s. His wife, Eleanor, also hunted extensively with the 7mm Mauser cartridge, and I'm going to read to you some text from a plaque in a rifle display case at the O'Connor Museum in Lewiston, Idaho. That's a cool place. You should definitely go visit it if you're ever in the Lewiston area. Okay, here we go. I quote, "In his book, The Big Game Rifle, Jack O'Connor describes how metalsmith Tom Burgess and stockmaker Russell Leonard built this rifle on a Czech VZ-24 action for him in 1951. Not long after, he let Eleanor try the rifle and she claimed it for her own. With the stock shortened and a recoil pad added, she used the rifle for most of her North American and African hunting, including taking of her award-winning Doll Ram in 1963 and a 60-inch kudu on her last safari in 1972. End of quote. There can't be too many rifles in existence that have taken both a Boone & Crockett Doll Sheep and a 60-inch kudu. Now, that wasn't her only rifle. Eleanor also notably had a Model 70 chambered in .30-06 that she also hunted with a lot. But especially after they modified the stock to fit her a little better, that rifle sounds like it was just about perfect for her. Like I keep mentioning, the 7mm Mauser just flat out works. So in that vein, let's move on to how the cartridge stacks up against a couple of other popular 7mm cartridges in the 7mm 08 Remington and the 7mm Remington Magnum. Specifically, we'll compare the 7mm Mauser, 7mm 08, and the 7mm Magnum with a light for caliber loading of Nosler's trophy grade 140 grain AccuBond ammunition for all three cartridges, as well as a heavier for caliber loading in the Federal PowerShock line with 150 grain soft point bullets for the 708 and 175 grain soft points for the 7 Mauser and the 7 Rim Mag. Now, the 7mm Mauser is pushing that 140 grain AccuBond at about 2,700 feet per second. Does that sound like another cartridge you may have heard of? Now, the 7mm 08 pushes that same bullet a little faster, about 28-25 feet per second, and the 7 Rim Mag pushes that same bullet even faster at about 31-25 feet per second. All three cartridges use the same bullet, just fired at different velocities. It's important to note here that, similar to the case with the 6.5 Swede, the 7mm Mauser has a lower SAMI maximum average pressure of 51,000 psi. Now, the European CIP standard for the 7 Mauser is a little higher at about 56,500 psi. So for reference, the 708 and the 7 Rim Mag both have a SAMI maximum average pressure of 61,000 psi. So 10,000 psi more than the 7 Mauser. And that accounts for a large portion of the performance discrepancy between these cartridges. Now, it's also worth noting that the CIP pressures of those two cartridges are about 60,000 psi and about 62,000 psi. So the pressure differential between the 7 Mauser and the newer 708 and 7 Rim Mag is smaller, but still there, even on the CIP side of things. Even so, this pressure differential I was talking about is reflected in ammo loadings where American manufacturers, in particular, tend to be a little more cautious with their factory loads out of fear that their ammunition may cause a catastrophic failure in an older rifle with a potentially weaker action. Now, that's not really a problem with modern production rifles that are in good condition, though, and hand loaders can take advantage of this. Look up those 3 cartridges in a hand loading manual, and you'll see that the max load for the 708 and the 7 Mauser are virtually identical in general, as well as with that 140 grain AccuBond in particular. So in some cases, you might see that the 708 might have a small advantage over the 7mm Mauser, but at their best, the 7mm 08 and the 7mm Mauser have almost identical ballistics in practical terms. Now, additionally, though, the 7 Mauser does have an advantage over the 7mm 08 in the bullet weight department. Max bullet weights for the 7mm 08 tend to top out around 150 grains or 160 grains in most factory loads. Hand loaders can go a little bit heavier, though. However, the 7mm Mauser is better suited to using 175 grain bullets. Now, of note, like we talked about a second ago, Federal produces 7mm Mauser with 175 grain power shock. The same is also true of the 7 Rim Mag, but they only make the 708 with a 150 grain power shock at the heaviest. Now, this is due in large part to the fact that the 7mm 08 is just a shorter cartridge overall. It has an overall length of 71 millimeters compared to 78 millimeters for the 7mm Mauser, and it packs basically the performance of the 7mm Mauser, maybe a little more, into a smaller package. So on one hand, the 7mm 08 fits into a short-action rifle, while the 7mm Mauser requires a long-action rifle. On the other hand, the 7mm Mauser is better suited to using heavier bullets. Now, the 7mm Remington Magnum has a longer case and a larger diameter case, and it also shoots that same size bullet. So the result is that it shoots it at a much higher velocity with a correspondingly flatter trajectory. Depending on the exact load we're talking about here, we're looking at about a 400 to 500 foot per second advantage in favor of the 7mm Remington Magnum here. Right, so that's a pretty significant difference. I mean, that's bigger than the difference between the 30-06 and the 300 Win Mag. So on one hand, that velocity advantage translates into a flatter trajectory, less wind deflection, and more retained energy at extended range. On the other hand, you get a lot more recoil and a lot more muzzle blast than the other cartridges. Additionally, when hunting game at shorter ranges, those high-velocity bullets generate a lot more bloodshot meat on thin-skinned game like white-tailed deer. Now, Kevin Robertson told a story in a podcast interview he and I did. I think it was episode 206 on our classic hunting cartridges. He used to have a rifle chambered in 7x64. That is a European cartridge, similar to, not quite as powerful as the 7mm Remington Magnum. Well, the conditions that he was hunting game under didn't facilitate very long-range shots. He was shooting a lot of stuff at, say, 50 to 150 yards. And so he was using that cartridge on game like Impala, which is similar in size to white-tailed deer. So they're not very big, not very thick-skinned. And so you're shooting that cartridge at thin-skinned game at relatively close range. And he said it was just disgusting to him how much meat he was losing from those animals with those high-velocity impacts like that. So he ended up actually getting that rifle rechambered to 7x57 Mauser, which worked out perfectly. It was still an extremely effective killer on plains game in that general size range, but it was a lot easier on people's shoulders, and it wasn't ruining as much meat. So you're getting the same basic killing performance out of it, and was working basically the same on the same sort of game that he was hunting with the higher velocity cartridge, but like I said, with just less recoil, less meat loss. So it's easy for me to see why he or someone else would make a decision like that. So going back to the comparison with the 708, the 7 Mauser, and the 7 Rim Mag. The cartridges are roughly comparable in terms of the size game they are suitable for hunting, right? Deer, elk, a lot of African plains game, stuff in that general size range. The only real significant differences between them are the variations in velocity, which translates into kinetic energy and trajectory, where the 7 Magnum does have an advantage on one hand, but then you also have the advantage in terms of recoil, where the 7mm Mauser and 7mm 08 have the edge. For the vast majority of medium game hunting situations at moderate range, the 3 cartridges are going to perform about the same, right? So they call it 250 yards and in. If you use a good quality bullet and you place your shot appropriately, the animal's probably not going to know the difference regardless of which one that you're using. Now, an interesting aside with the 7 Rim Mag, I've talked about this also in other podcast episodes as well. When that cartridge first hit the scene in the 1960s, it was using basically exactly the same bullet as the 7mm Mauser, but firing it a lot faster. Now, that worked great for longer range situations, right? You shoot something like an elk or something at 300 or 400 yards. That extra velocity is great because it flattens their trajectory, makes it easier to hit the animal, and it's retaining more kinetic energy at that range. And it was a quite effective killer under those conditions. But using bullets that were designed for 7mm Mauser impact velocities, but jacking up the velocity, shooting something at close range, like shooting an elk at 80 yards with it or something, you are running into higher odds of having the bullet catastrophically fail or quote-unquote pancake when it hits the animal because it's just not designed for that sort of a high-velocity impact. So interestingly, the 7mm Remington Magnum initially got a reputation of being a quote-unquote wounder when it first came on the scene because of the poor bullet selection that they had at the time for that cartridge. Now, using the cartridge with a tougher bullet like a partition or a bonded bullet or a Barnes or something basically eliminated all of those problems at close range, and then they still worked fine at a little bit longer range. So that's not really a problem anymore, but that is a situation that also exemplifies, like I talked about with Kevin Robertson a second ago, in addition to that extra recoil and the possibility of excessive meat loss with those high velocity impacts at close range, you can also run into problems with bullet failure with a high velocity impact at close range too, if you're not using the right thing. So it just goes to show that not only can a very high velocity impact not really give you any additional benefits, but it could also give you some additional problems. But, like I said, that 7mm Mauser just sits in that sweet spot where you're getting great performance, great penetration, great bullet expansion, great effects on game without a lot of recoil, without a lot of excess lost meat. All that stuff going on there, like I said, in that, say, out to 200, 250 yards, just about perfect. It's not flashy, but it works. Now, the 7mm Mauser would not be my choice for a situation where I need to take a shot at longer range. You call it over 250 or over 300 yards. But there aren't a lot of situations where that's really even necessary, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've taken game in excess of 300 yards in my life. So this is a situation where if I was going into a hunt knowing that just due to the nature of the game and the nature of the terrain, a little bit longer range shot like that was more likely, then I'd go with the 7 Rim Mag. Otherwise, I don't know that there's any reason to go with that higher velocity cartridge like that when you have the 708 and the 7mm Mauser that will work just as good or maybe even better at closer range. All right, let's talk about 7mm Mauser ammo. Now, while the cartridge was always more popular in Europe and Africa than in the United States, it still does have enough of a following that it's not that difficult to find 7x57 Mauser factory ammo at most gun stores at a lot of places all over the world, North America, Europe, Africa, Australia, that sort of thing. I wouldn't say it's super popular, but it is there. For instance, Federal, Hornady, Norma, Nosler, Privé Partisan, Remington, S&B, and Winchester all manufacture at least one 7mm Mauser factory load. 140 grain bullets are probably the most popular these days, but you can find 139 grain, 145 grain, 150 grain, 173 grain, and 175 grain bullets too. And due to advances in propellants, modern factory-loaded 7 Mauser ammo also does have a little bit better ballistics compared to the original loads from the 1890s. For instance, Federal advertises muzzle velocity of about 2,390 feet per second for their 7x57 175 grain power shock ammo I mentioned earlier. Likewise, that Nosler load with 140 grain AccuBond that I also mentioned earlier is a great flat-shooting, hard-hitting 7 Mauser factory load that's probably the best load you can find for the cartridge if you want to stretch out your range just a little bit. But that bullet is also plenty tough, and it's going to work great at close range too. Now, as far as 7mm Mauser rifles go, right, that cartridge didn't catch on in the U.S. like it did in Europe. So American gun manufacturers never really made large number of rifles chambered in the cartridge. Among other models, American companies produced small numbers of Remington Rolling Block, Remington Model 700, Winchester Model 70, and Ruger No. 1 rifles chambered in the cartridge over the years. Not surprisingly, Mauser itself probably made more rifles chambered in that cartridge than any other company. It's still possible to find Model 1893 Mauser, Model 1895 Mauser, and derivatives of the Model 1898 chambered in that cartridge that are in pretty good condition and for a pretty reasonable price. They also made large numbers of commercial rifles chambered in 7mm Mauser specifically designed for sporting use, and the company also continues to manufacture the M98 standard rifle in the cartridge too. John Rigby and Company also produce a number of rifles in 275 Rigby. Remember, that's just what the British call the 7mm Mauser. They made it for British citizens hunting all over the globe. You can also still get a couple models from Rigby in the cartridge, and occasionally a good used rifle will turn up for sale too. The problem with Rigby rifles is they don't come cheap though. Now, as we wrap up, I would say that in many ways, the 7mm Mauser is something of a quote-unquote Goldilocks hunting cartridge. It's flat enough shooting, and it hits hard enough to ethically take most species of big game at reasonable ranges. Like I say, 200, 250 yards, maybe a little farther. But it also shoots at a moderate velocity, so it doesn't have tooth-rattling recoil in a lighter rifle, and it also isn't going to give you a ton of bloodshot and lost and useless meat like you would with a higher velocity cartridge. Now, while many modern cartridges surpass the capabilities of the 7 Mauser on paper, I would advise you not to get too wrapped up in that stuff. Yes, performance on paper definitely matters, but like I keep saying, this cartridge just flat out worked, and it's tough to argue with results like that. Really, the biggest problem I can think of with the cartridge these days is that ammo and rifles aren't that easy to find. Yes, you can find them online. A lot of gun stores will carry stuff in that product, but it's not nearly as popular as other things. The 270, the 308, 30-06, and it cannot hold a candle to something like the 6.5 Creedmoor in terms of popularity, as much as that might pain people. In episode 279, James Bradley actually talked about switching from the 7mm Mauser to the 270 for a lot of his deer hunting in the UK because he was just having a hard time finding 7mm Mauser ammo. I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the COVID-induced ammo shortages, but I can understand why a guy would make that change. As good as something is, if you have a hard time finding ammo for it, like Caramojo Bell had with the 6.5x54, I can understand why someone would make that change. So it's still out there. It's not as popular as it used to be. It's still there. This may be a case where you just need to look harder for ammo or maybe hand load for it or something along those lines. Now, it's still a great choice for a hunter who wants to go afield with a classic cartridge and an elegant rifle. Now, to that end, as I record this today, I literally just got an email from Joseph Von Benedict talking about how he just got back from a hunt in Namibia with 2 of his kids. They used a Park West Arms Model 76 rifle chambered in 275 Rigby, and they took a bunch of plains game with it, and it was wonderful. Good rifle for his teenage kids to carry without a lot of recoil, but very effective on a wide range of game like they dealt with. Among other things, they took blue wildebeest, gemsbok, and kudu with the 275 Rigby. None of those species are small or especially easy to kill creatures either. So like I said, the 7mm Mauser is still a darn effective choice, but it may just require a little bit more effort to obtain a rifle and or ammunition than is the case with other more modern cartridges. But it's hard to argue with results like that. Plus, I think it's also just a really cool cartridge with a great legacy. As usual, I have written a really detailed article about the 7mm Mauser for the Big Game Hunting blog, and I will put a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. Now, I talk about Hunting Guns 101 all the time in these cartridge comparisons. So if you enjoy these episodes, I think you'll love Hunting Guns 101 because it's full of the same sort of information contained in these episodes, these cartridge comparison and cartridge profile episodes. And you'll also get access to a level of detail and analysis I don't get into in the podcast, like, among other things, specific rifles I recommend for each cartridge, specific ammunition I recommend for the cartridge, and for different hunting situations, and what I think all of this stuff is best suited for, the trade-offs associated with making changes to your setup, and why. So if you want more of this, purchase Hunting Guns 101. I guarantee you will learn lots of useful information about practical ballistics and firearms in general in that training that will help you be more successful afield and fill more tags on your hunts. This is an investment in your education and your training that will pay off for decades to come. Click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com/form and fill out the order form to sign up and get instant access today. That's huntingguns101.com/form, F-O-R-M. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.